Jesus said, "Do not doubt, but believe." I want to talk today about living in the aftermath of the resurrection. I want to talk today about living in the aftermath of the resurrection, and it's not easy to do. You may notice looking around the church that there's not too many of us here today, and I'll tell you that this is true in every single church throughout the world. The first day that has the Sunday of the year that has the highest attendance when the church is packed in any single church, which one is it? Easter. And the Sunday with the lowest attendance is? The Sunday after Easter. Any church you go to, it's true. It's tough living in the aftermath of the resurrection. We love that joyous day when we proclaim the Lord is risen, when we shout the alleluias. But figuring out what we're going to do after that is tricky. Thomas knows a lot about that. I feel bad for Thomas. Every year on this Sunday, the Sunday after the resurrection Sunday, we read the story of Thomas. And what do we call him usually? Doubting Thomas. I feel bad for the man going down in history as the one disciple who doubted, especially when you think for a moment about the situation, what sort of happened. Because he's been there, right? With the disciples all the way through, walked with Jesus those 3 years through all of his ministry, came with him to Jerusalem, and like the rest of the disciples, he was shouting with songs of acclamation, saying, "The Lord has come to be crowned as king." And then, like all the disciples, he had his heart broken when he saw Jesus carried away by the Romans, when he saw him put on trial, when he saw him spat on and tortured and degraded, when he heard the news that his friend, his teacher, the one he believed was the Messiah, had suffered a cruel and torturous and humiliating death. And like the other disciples, he spent that whole weekend, 3 days, locked in the upper room, trembling in terror, wondering if they were going to be next, if there was going to be a pounding on their doors, the police came to take them away. Now, I got to put a little footnote in here, and this is just a footnote, but it's an important one. It's not my sermon, but I got to put this footnote in here because you probably heard it. It mentioned this thing that they were locked in the upper room for fear of the Judeans. You probably heard in other translations it says for fear of the Jews. And I got to say something about that because it may leave you scratching your head, right? What does that mean for fear of the Jews? Because Jesus was Jewish. The disciples were Jewish. And maybe, like a lot of us, you know how these words about the fear of the Jews and the way all the way through John's gospel that he talks about the Jews railing against Jesus, you may know how these words have been used like a hammer to punish the Jewish people, to incite violence against them. And we've seen how that plays out in recent years, the acts of violence that have been perpetuated against synagogues, against God's chosen people when they are gathered in worship. And you may read John's gospel and you notice that it seems like he's got kind of a grudge. He's got an axe to grind with the Jews. And you might ask yourself, what's that about? And we can't really know for certain. But there's a theory I've heard that I think might be true, and I just want to share it with you, and then I'm going to close this footnote and go on with the sermon. It's important. We've got to talk about this because, again, in this country today, violence is being done against God's chosen people. We've got to say something about it. What I've heard suggested about this, about why does John have this axe to grind with the Jewish people when Jesus and the disciples were themselves Jewish, the suggestion I've heard is that John's gospel is probably written by Samaritans. And you remember Samaritans in the gospel. Samaritans and Jewish people were both Israelites. They both came from that line of Jacob. They both traced themselves down through the patriarchs. They both had received the teaching of Moses. They both announced and proclaimed and praised the God of Israel. But they had had a disagreement about what it meant to be an Israelite. Now, they lived in the same place, and they each kind of pointed at the other one and said, "You are not true Israelites." They lived close by. It's clear they shared the same language, the same culture. There was a lot of intermarriage. But they nonetheless were kind of pointing fingers at each other. We can guess that John's gospel is probably written by Samaritans, first of all, because all the scholars who look at it say his Greek is not very good. It looks like Aramaic is his first language. And you may remember Aramaic was the language of the Jewish people, but also the Samaritans. And again, he's got this thing where he keeps railing against the Jews all the way through his gospel. And he also lifts up the Samaritans. It's in his gospel that we hear all these good things about how faithful Samaritans are. What I want you to need to understand about these two groups of people is they were kin. They were close cousins and family. And they kind of had a little bit of a beef and a grudge against each other, but nonetheless, they were family. You may remember from family cookouts or gatherings or whatever it may be about family business, right? About arguments that happen within the family. But if someone comes in from outside, we don't talk about it when they're around, right? Because we know they might take those words and kind of use them against us. So I want to suggest to you that what we're seeing in this gospel is a bit of family business, a bit of family drama. It's not our business because we are not Israelites, but we put it out there sometimes and it's used hurtfully against God's chosen people. That's basically the end of the footnote. We got to acknowledge the way these words have been used like a hammer to punish God's chosen people, to punish Jesus' own family, right? And whenever it comes up, we as Christians have to speak against it. So I'm just put that footnote there. We'll move on with the rest of the sermon. They are locked up in the upper room, the disciples, trembling with fear because they are expecting a knock at the door and the voice of the police coming to say, you are now taken away. You are the ones who are going to be next on the chopping block. They're fearful. And for whatever reason, in that one moment, Thomas steps away. He's out of the room. We don't know why. We're never told why. Did he go out to get them something to eat because they'd been locked in the upper room for a while? I don't know. Did he have some business he had to take care of? We don't know. He steps out for one moment that weekend, and when he comes back, the disciples say, the most extraordinary thing has happened. He came back. He is alive, and we saw him. Now imagine what that must be like for Thomas, right? Having walked with them all this time, having suffered through the crucifixion like all of them, having trembled that whole weekend in fear, stepping out for one moment and coming back and hearing they received the good news, and he was not there. Have you ever been at a family dinner or at a party, right, where you step out for a second and you come back and everybody's laughing, right? And you're like, what was it? Tell me. And then they try and tell you, and they say, well, I guess you had to be here, right? And that little sense of bitterness, that's a minor thing. This is the most important thing that's ever happened, and they all saw it. But he was left out. Imagine what he must feel in that moment. We can also, when we look at his story, you get a sense that he's got a real reason to be upset about this. Thomas shows up a couple other times in the Gospels at very, very important moments. We, in the story of Lazarus, right, when Jesus receives word that his friend Lazarus is sick and dying, and he said, I'm going to go to Bethany to help him. All the disciples are like, you can't go back there because the authorities are waiting for you, and they're going to capture you, and they're going to try and kill you. And Jesus says, I'm going. Thomas is the one who says to the other disciples, if he is going to die, then we are going with him. He's the one who convinces the disciples to follow right into the midst of danger, right? At the Last Supper, when Jesus tells the disciples, where I am going, I go to prepare a place for you. Thomas is the one who asks, but we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? And Jesus says to Thomas, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. So he's been there through the thick of it in the hardest moments, and he was the one who said to the disciples, we're going with them to deal with this thing right until the end. He is the one who received that special promise, you know the way. So he might be scratching his head, leaving us up wondering, like, why was I left out? Of all the disciples, I was faithful. There's one last detail that I want to put in there, and this is just a little bit of speculation. You may have noticed that it says Thomas, who was called the what? The twin, right? And you may be scratching your head being like, but whose twin? There's always two of them, right? Whose twin is he? Now, we don't know for certain. But I'll tell you, there's a piece of tradition and story that's out there. You may have heard me say before that the Ethiopian church in Africa is the oldest organized church in the world. The second oldest is a church called the Mar Thoma Church that's in India, the second oldest church in the world. And according to their tradition, Thomas the Apostle was the one who brought the good news to them. And the way they tell it, he was called the twin because he was Jesus' younger brother, who looked so much like him that they could be mistaken for one another. So imagine if that's true, because it's odd that they tell him he's the twin without telling us why. Imagine here he is, walked with the disciples this whole time, stood up and said, we're going with him to face the crucifixion along his side. His own younger brother, the only one left out in the moment of resurrection. And think how you would feel. So he's hurt. He's angered. He's upset. Why was I left out? And then he says this thing. I will not believe unless I stick my finger in the hands where the nail pierced him. I will not believe unless I shove my hand into his side where he was cut. And that's a little bit extreme, right? Because I think most of us at that moment would say, I won't believe unless I see it with my own eyes. But he goes so much further, and it may leave us kind of feeling, this is gross, it's a little disgusting. I imagine the disciples had that same reaction when he said it and saying, whoa, slow down, Thomas. There's no need to do all that. It's much. But you might notice another detail. Do you notice when you read the Gospels, the disciples didn't tell him that Jesus still had the marks of the crucifixion. They didn't mention it to him. Somehow he guessed it. And that's not an obvious thing. Because if someone had told me Jesus came back from the dead and he is alive again, I would assume that he had been healed. But somehow Thomas guesses, understands, intuits that Jesus has the marks of crucifixion. And he says, I'm not going to believe unless I stick my fingers in those marks. Why does he say that? Now, partly, he's human like the rest of us and has his faults like the rest of us. He may be feeling a little bit salty about having been left out, right? And being like, I'm not going to believe unless I can really jab it to him and make him hurt a little bit because I'm hurting too. But I think there's something else going on too. I think he's dealing with the aftermath of the resurrection. Because we do show up on Easter, we proclaim the good news, we proclaim that Jesus is risen, and then we have to figure out how to carry that truth through all the troubles and the hardships of our life. This last week, after proclaiming the resurrection, just this last week, we heard in the news, right, that North Korea is ramping up their nuclear arsenal, right, feeling precarious and in danger. We heard that right here in Washington, D.C., the week of Easter, there was another shooting in a McDonald's, right, and members of our city were killed by acts of violence that had been like a plague throughout our city. This week, I received news that a close family friend had gotten a terminal diagnosis. I know you've had hardships too. So how do we live into the resurrection when we're still dealing with all the troubles and hardships of our lives? So Thomas says, I need to know that he still shows the wounds. I need to know that he is still with us. That's what he's asking. I need to know that he still understands what we are going through, that he's still with us in the midst of it. Because if he's jumped through on the other side to where everything is all good and hunky-dory, Thomas says, he's no good to us. Because we still have to walk out of these doors and face down those Romans. We still got to figure out what tomorrow is going to look like. We still have to face the trials and tribulations of this life. And so if he doesn't still bear the wounds of what he suffered, he's no good to me, Thomas says. So Thomas says these words, shocks them all. A week later, Jesus shows up and shows him, look, I'm still here with you. In everything you suffer and everything you face and endure, I am still with you, and I'm ready to carry you through to the other side. I bring the resurrection to all of the trials and tribulations of your life. Everything you must endure, he says, I bring you abundant life every single day. And then notice our doubting Thomas, as we call him, our doubting Thomas, what he says next. My Lord, my God. And this is the detail I want you to know because it's so important. He is the first disciple ever to say those words. My God. They've called him other things. The other disciples have said he is the Messiah, the Holy One, the chosen one of God. But our doubting Thomas is the first one to look at the risen Lord in his face and say, my God. Knowing, as Jesus has proved, that I am with you until the end in everything you endure, Thomas says, if there is any God worth worshiping, it is you. And Jesus makes this promise to him of abundant life. So this Sunday, this Doubting Thomas Sunday, my prayer for us is that we hear and receive that same message of truth that was given to Thomas, that the Lord is with us, the risen Lord is with us in each and every moment of our lives, and everything we must struggle through and endure, bringing victory where it seems that all was lost. And my prayer is that in faith and courage like Thomas, we may look at the risen Lord and declare, my God. Amen.